There comes a moment when words no longer carry weight, when silence becomes the sharpest language, and presence becomes the most expensive gift you can give. To touch the heart so deeply that it aches in your absence, you don't need drama, you don't need pleading, and you don't need explanations. You need only one decisive act done with elegance, certainty, and grace. Once you do it, the nights will turn restless, and the soul will learn the taste of longing. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from weakness, nor from fear, but from power. It is the silence born when you decide to no longer give your energy away. The moment you withdraw quietly, without anger, without desperate words, without begging to be understood, the world shifts. The weight of your presence, once taken for granted, suddenly becomes unbearable in its absence. What was once assumed to always be there, to always respond, to always comfort, is now replaced with a void that cannot be filled with noise. The silent withdrawal is not about punishment. It is not about playing games or manipulating emotions. It is the art of stepping back gracefully when you realize that your worth is not being honored. You don't slam the door. You don't create a scene. You don't scream your value into ears that refuse to hear. Instead, you walk away with quiet dignity, and it is that silence that pierces deeper than any words ever could. Because silence has a way of haunting. Words can be argued with, denied, or twisted, but silence leaves no room for defense. It forces reflection. It becomes a mirror showing the weight of what has been lost. The absence echoes in places where your presence once brought comfort, laughter, and warmth. The space you leave behind becomes the loudest reminder of what they never thought they could lose. When you withdraw in silence, you shift the energy completely. You are no longer the one chasing, the one explaining, the one justifying. You are no longer feeding into cycles of confusion or neglect. Instead, you stand still, and in that stillness, your strength rises. It is not about how loudly you demand to be valued, but about how powerfully your absence reveals your worth. There is something unsettling about quiet strength. It cannot be touched, it cannot be argued with, it cannot be defeated. Silent withdrawal shows that you are not dependent, that your heart does not beg, and that your spirit refuses to be diminished. It communicates without speaking. I know who I am, and I no longer need to prove it to you. That unspoken truth is far heavier than any confrontation could ever be. And so the nights grow restless. The mind replays every detail, every memory, every moment where your presence was a given. Silence doesn't simply disappear. It lingers like a shadow. It clings like an echo. It becomes the reminder that cannot be silenced. Where your laughter once filled the air, there is now only stillness. Where your words once soothed, there is now emptiness. That is the power of withdrawal, the kind that doesn't scream, but instead whispers to the heart in the deepest hours of the night. This silence is not weakness. It is the language of strength. It is not revenge. It is self-respect. And when done once with clarity and grace, it becomes unforgettable. The mirror of confidence is not something you hold up to others. It is something you embody so naturally that it unsettles the air around you. It is the quiet radiance of knowing who you are without needing anyone else to confirm it. When you carry yourself with that kind of self-assurance, it becomes impossible to be overlooked. You no longer beg for attention. You no longer fight for validation. You no longer shrink just to be accepted. Instead, you stand tall in your truth, and that truth reflects back like a mirror, forcing the other person to see themselves more clearly through the brightness of your certainty. Confidence doesn't need words. It doesn't need explanations. It is in the way you move, the way you choose your silences, the way you refuse to argue about your worth. It is the unshakable presence that says, I am enough, with or without you. That energy is powerful because it cannot be faked, it cannot be bought, and it cannot be borrowed. It comes only when you stop tying your value to someone else's recognition. And once it blooms within you, it becomes impossible for anyone to ignore. When you radiate this kind of confidence, you become unforgettable. Not because you try to impress, but because you refuse to compete. You are not seeking to be chosen. You are already chosen by yourself. That inner security creates a shift so deep that it rattles anyone who ever thought you needed them more than they needed you. Suddenly, the balance changes. The one who once believed they had the upper hand finds themselves disarmed because they can no longer control you with silence, distance, or approval. You have become the mirror, and in your confidence, they are confronted with their own insecurities. The beauty of confidence is that it is both soft and unyielding. It doesn't scream. It doesn't fight. It simply exists like the steady glow of a flame that cannot be put out. It shines in the way you carry yourself, the way you don't react to chaos, the way you choose peace over noise. And that calmness unsettles deeply because it shows that you are not bound, not desperate, not lost without their attention. You remain whole, and wholeness is magnetic. This mirror does more than reflect. It reveals. It reveals what was taken for granted, what was overlooked, what was thought to be replaceable, but never truly was. Confidence makes absence heavier because it reminds them of what they let slip through their fingers. Someone who didn't need to beg, someone who didn't need to prove, someone who knew their worth all along. That realization cuts deeper than any spoken confrontation ever could. And so the nights grow long. The memory of your quiet strength lingers like an unanswered question, like a shadow that won't fade. The mirror of your confidence does not just show who you are. It forces them to see who they are not. And that reflection will burn long after the lights have gone out. The subtle goodbye is not spoken loudly, it is not dressed in anger, and it is never rushed. It arrives gently, like the closing of a book after the final page has been read. It is quiet, almost unnoticed in the moment, but it carries a weight that echoes long after. This kind of goodbye does not come with accusations or explanations, because explanations would only weaken its power. It comes with calmness, with grace, with a certainty that requires no validation. And that is what makes it unforgettable. There is a mystery in leaving without chaos. Most expect farewells to be loud, filled with tears or desperate words that can later be dismissed. But a subtle goodbye does the opposite. It leaves nothing to argue with, nothing to resist, nothing to fight against. It is like a door closing softly instead of slamming, yet that softness leaves behind a haunting silence. Because when there are no final words to hold on to, the mind begins to invent them, to replay every past moment searching for clues, for answers that will never come. A subtle goodbye is powerful because it shifts the story. It is not about what was lost in anger, but about what slipped away quietly, without permission, without warning. That kind of departure lingers like a shadow in the back of the mind, a reminder of something precious that could not be grasped tightly enough. The absence feels heavier when there was no dramatic ending to mark it. It simply disappears, leaving behind only the weight of unfinished thoughts. This form of goodbye does not announce itself, and that is what makes it so piercing. It's not about punishing, it's not about revenge. It's about choosing yourself in silence. It is saying without words, I don't need to fight for a place in your world. I will walk away, and you will feel my absence when the nights grow quiet. That message cannot be forgotten because it was never spoken aloud. It lingers in the imagination, and the imagination is always louder in the dark. When someone leaves in anger, it's easier to dismiss them as emotional, dramatic, or weak. When someone leaves softly, with dignity, with no sign of desperation, that absence becomes unbearable. It raises questions that cannot be answered. It plants seeds of regret that grow larger with time. The memory of that subtle goodbye turns into a constant reminder of strength, of control, of a love that was given freely, but never begged to stay. And so the nights stretch on, filled with the echo of what was once taken for granted. The goodbye is not loud, but it is permanent. It is not dramatic, but it is final. It is the kind of farewell that doesn't need to be spoken because its silence says everything. And when the realization finally strikes, when the absence becomes too heavy to ignore, that subtle goodbye turns into the loudest cry the heart will ever hear. The power of absence is something most never understand until it is too late. Presence is easy to overlook because it is constant, familiar, always there to fill the silence. But absence is louder than any words, sharper than any confrontation, heavier than any demand. When you step away, not with noise, but with quiet certainty, you awaken something that no explanation could ever achieve. The emptiness you leave behind becomes the mirror in which everything forgotten suddenly comes alive. Absence has a way of reshaping memory. The moments that were dismissed now return with clarity. The laughter once taken lightly now echoes with a haunting sweetness. The warmth that was overlooked begins to burn in its absence. Every little gesture, every smile, every glance, all the things once brushed aside as ordinary suddenly transform into treasures that can no longer be touched. This is the cruelty of absence. It elevates what was ignored, it magnifies what was undervalued, and it turns what was lost into something priceless. The power of absence does not need to announce itself. It does not scream, it does not argue, it does not demand. It simply exists in its emptiness, and that emptiness becomes unbearable. The nights grow longer because there is no one to fill them. The days feel heavier because the rhythm once brought by your presence is gone. Even in crowded rooms, even in laughter with others, the absence lingers like a shadow that cannot be outrun. It lives in the quiet moments, in the pauses, in the stillness before sleep, when the heart is most vulnerable and the mind is unguarded. What makes absence so powerful is that it cannot be controlled. Words can be debated, arguments can be twisted, and emotions can be dismissed. But absence cannot be touched. It leaves nothing to fight against, nothing to push back on, nothing to dismiss. It simply remains, an invisible weight pressing against the heart, and the more someone tries to ignore it, the louder it becomes. This is why absence is often felt more deeply than presence. Presence can be taken for granted, assumed, expected. But when it is gone, its value finally comes to light. That realization stings because it comes too late, when the chance to hold on to it has already slipped away. The silence becomes a wound that no distraction can heal, and the memory of what was lost turns into a constant echo in the mind. The power of absence is not in punishment, but in revelation. It reveals what could not be seen before. It forces the heart to confront its own neglect, its own blindness, its own mistakes. And when it comes from someone who leaves with grace and dignity, not with bitterness, the absence becomes even sharper, even more unbearable. For there is no anger to cling to, no flaws to blame, no excuses to make. There is only the weight of loss, echoing louder than any goodbye ever could. The reversal of control is not loud, it is not dramatic, and it is not announced. It simply happens in silence when you stop giving your power away. For as long as you keep chasing, explaining, and proving yourself, the balance remains in the hands of the one who believes they can decide your worth. But the moment you choose stillness, the moment you no longer react, the moment you refuse to play the endless game of pleasing and convincing, the ground shifts beneath their feet. What they once believed was theirs to control slips quietly from their grasp. Control has never been about who speaks the loudest, but about who remains unshaken. When you detach with calm certainty, you no longer move according to their rhythm. You stop dancing to their silences. You stop bending to their delays. You stop feeding into the cycle of hoping for scraps of attention. Instead, you stand firmly in yourself, and in that firmness, you reclaim what was always yours, your freedom. And nothing unsettles the heart more than realizing that the one who once seemed dependent has now become untouchable. The reversal is not about revenge. It is not about playing games or pretending not to care. It is about clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when you realize that your value was never tied to how much they noticed you. By walking in that truth, you no longer beg for their effort, you inspire it. You no longer chase their presence, you command it without a word. That is the moment control changes hands, when they are left restless, uncertain, and haunted by the silence they once used as a weapon. Because the truth is, control only exists when someone responds. If they withdraw and you chase, they win. If they speak carelessly and you argue back, they win. But when they expect a reaction and receive none, when they expect a cry and are met with silence, when they expect to be begged and instead watch you rise calmly higher, that is when the game ends. That is when the power no longer belongs to them. The shift is subtle but piercing. It is seen in the way your absence now feels heavier than their presence. It is felt in the way they suddenly wonder where you have gone, why you no longer bend, why your energy no longer orbits around them. What was once assumed to be permanent has now become distant, and that distance cuts deeper than anger ever could. The heart is left restless because it realizes too late that control was never truly theirs. It was given, and it can be taken back. The reversal of control is freedom disguised as silence. It is not about winning or losing, but about remembering that you cannot be owned. It is the quiet reclaiming of your dignity, the firm decision to no longer move at anyone's command but your own. And once that moment comes, the one who thought they held the power is left in the dark, restless, replaying every memory, every mistake, every silence, as they realize that control has slipped forever from their hands. The memory trigger is not always something grand, not always something deliberate. It is often the smallest detail, the softest gesture, the most ordinary moment that suddenly becomes unforgettable once it is gone. It could be the way your laughter filled the room, the warmth in your eyes when you listened, the quiet way you touched their arm without saying a word. These little pieces of you, once overlooked, turn into echoes that follow them long after you've withdrawn. And the more they try to ignore them, the more persistent those echoes become, especially when the night grows silent. What makes the memory trigger so powerful is its simplicity. It does not need to be forced, it does not need to be staged, it does not need to be planned. It is the imprint you leave behind just by being yourself, by offering kindness, by showing presence, by giving warmth that was once taken for granted. When that warmth is gone, the absence of it burns deeper than anything else. They will search for it in others, they will seek to replace it, but it will never feel the same, because the memory of what was real can never be erased by substitutes. The mind is a restless thing. It replays, it rewinds, it reimagines. When the memory trigger strikes, it takes the heart back to moments they once believed would last forever. A smile in the morning, a word of comfort at night, the familiarity of your voice, it all comes rushing back when there is no longer access to it. And the weight of that realization is unbearable because the memory becomes both a comfort and a torment. Comfort because it reminds them of what they once had. Torment because it reminds them that they can never hold it again. This is why the memory trigger haunts most deeply in the quiet hours of the night. Distractions fade, the noise of the world settles, and the mind is left alone with its own thoughts. That is when the smallest details resurface, uninvited but unrelenting. The softness of your touch, the sound of your laughter, the light in your eyes, they return like ghosts, pressing against the heart until it aches. Sleep becomes restless because no matter how tightly the eyes are shut, the memory refuses to fade. The power of this trigger lies in the fact that it cannot be undone. Once an imprint is made, it cannot be erased. Once the heart has known a certain kind of presence, it cannot pretend it never existed. The more they try to bury it, the deeper it digs itself into the soul. And that is why a single act, a single presence, a single moment of your grace is enough to leave them crying in the dark, unable to escape what lingers inside their own memory. The memory trigger does not shout, it does not demand, it whispers. But its whispers are endless. They creep into the quietest moments, they fill the deepest silences, they turn the nights long and heavy. And when the realization strikes that no one else can recreate what you once gave freely, the memory becomes more than just a thought. It becomes a wound that never fully heals. In the end, it is never the loud gestures that leave the deepest mark, but the quiet ones. The silence that lingers, the confidence that cannot be shaken, the goodbye whispered instead of shouted, the absence that weighs heavier than presence, the control reclaimed without a word, and the memory that refuses to fade. These are the things that echo long after the moment has passed, the things that haunt the heart when the world goes still at night. You do not need to demand. You do not need to plead. You do not need to break yourself to be seen. You only need to stand in your own strength, to walk with dignity, to know your worth so deeply that your very absence becomes unforgettable. And when you do this once, with clarity, with calm, with grace, the soul that overlooked you will come to understand that losing you is not a simple loss. It is a wound carved into the quiet, a fire that does not burn out, a longing that will not let them rest. That is the power of doing less yet becoming everything. That is the cry that will rise in the night, not from your lips, but from their heart.